Welcome to Talent Talks, the podcast where your host, Dan Maisie, dives into hiring's ins and outs. Our goal is to reveal how to attract top talent. Through interviews with leaders in sports, media and entertainment, we explore job search and recruitment trends, offer interview tips and strategies to differentiate yourself and uncover their hiring insights. Whether you're prepping for an interview or interested in hiring trends, Talent Talks is your essential resource. Let's dive in. Today, we're joined by Paul Blanchard, a seasoned CEO with over 25 years in the sport and leisure industry. Paul has carved a niche for himself in commercial marketing and high-performance operations, significantly impacting the sports sector globally. His extremely successful tenure as CEO of Commonwealth Games led to Team England achieving its most successful Commonwealth Games in history, clinching 176 medals at Birmingham 2022. Post-Games, Paul founded 176 Sport, a consultancy dedicated to enhancing organisational and operational excellence. Through 176 Sport, Paul continues to leverage his vast experience to solve challenges within the sports sector, offering a range of services from business consultancy to major event strategy. Join us as we delve into Paul's insights on recruitment and talent strategy and explore how his transparent, collaborative approach can inform and inspire in the ever-evolving world of sports and beyond. Paul, welcome to Talent Talks.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
How are you today? How's everything going?
All is well. All is well. Very much looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Well, let's get straight into it. We asked this to each of our guests as the starter question. What are your experiences of hiring and being hired, and do you have any lessons learned?
I've been hiring and been hired for the past 35 years. Most of that in sport. So I've got a fair amount of experience. Some good, some less so. On the hiring side, it has tended to be putting together senior leadership teams, not necessarily from scratch, but, repurposing organizations and putting together 4 or 5 or 6 direct reports, which would tend to be my senior leadership team. So that's probably been the consistent theme when I've been hiring. In a Commonwealth Games world, which is my world that I've just stepped out of, or an Olympic major events world, you also put together major teams, which are people it's a combination of volunteers and short-term contracts and secondments and various other people coming into the fold as well. So there's that end of the spectrum, which I've done a lot of. And then on the hired fronts, I've been at that end as well, where, some of those processes have been excellent, really enjoyable, some absolutely dreadful. And although most of my executive hired days are probably behind me, although you never say never, and more of my most recent conversations have been around being hired as a consultant or as a possible non-exec. So probably I've ticked most of your boxes there, I think.
Excellent news. Well, this promises to be a fantastic conversation. I'm going to go straight into it. And you mentioned about the experiences when you're being hired of being both positive and negative. Let's focus on the positives to start off with. What have you taken from those positive experiences and pushed into your own hiring practices? And what are your key focuses when you are hiring, or when you were hiring for those executive teams?
Yeah, and I think, the point is, you want to put together, whether you're hiring for one position or a group of positions, you want the best possible people in those slots. And to do that, you want the process to be enjoyable, because it is a two-way process. You might offer somebody a role, decide they don't want it. So that's a remarkable waste of time to go through that process. So it's got to be enjoyable. It's got to be engaging. It's got to, I think, run smoothly. Preferably not. I've been through some processes where they're extremely drawn out and you've got the potential of losing the person's interest, or that's certainly a negative. And I think in that process, you want to find somebody or a group of people that clearly have the right skill set. That's blindingly obvious. But when you get down to the final shortlist, if you haven't got people with the right skill set, something's gone fearfully wrong during the rest of that process. And then it's about team fit, chemistry, understanding the values, what they will add to the group, both from an experience and expertise, but also a broader thinking, a diversity of thought perspective. All those factors come into the mix. But at that point, you're actually, I think, looking for, team fit rather than necessarily the best specialist.
And how do you approach, from an interviewing perspective, getting quite detailed here, but how would you approach those final interviews where you are looking for the more value-based elements and the more teamwork-based elements compared to the skills? What's the difference between how you would approach those types of interviews in comparison to the initial interviews where you are much more focused on the skill side of things, and they're almost a bit more of a formulaic style interview?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You go through a formula to get to a long list and then start working through the long list. And then when you get to the short list, that's when the fun really starts. And I always prefer to recruit in-house rather than the use of an external agency, although I've definitely done that. And, there's some very good agencies out there, but you tend to have more control if you are doing it in-house. My preferred approach is to have a small panel. 3 people is enough. That's a diverse panel from within the organization, occasionally a third party support as well from an organization such as Sport England or UK Sport, just to help us on the way. But it's generally in-house, 3 people, diverse panel, a range of questions to go through because there's information that you want to tease out of that. But I'm absolutely pathologically opposed to a hard and fast script because I think you've got to allow the questions or the answers to take the individual in the directions that they want to go, because actually you learn more about them in those answers, I think, than the scripted ones. You, of course, need a scorecard because you have to have a fair assessment of each of the candidates. But I always favoured a weighted scorecard. So you're ticking boxes on experience and expertise, but it's the areas around resilience and problem solving. And then the higher weighted for me tends to be around team fit, culture, values, diversity of thought, and somebody that will add value to the management team. And so there's an element of hard and fast scoring there, but there's an element of interpretation, an element of your own thinking and the thinking of those panel members. And then at the end of that process, you'll have a score. And if a candidate's miles clear on all 3 scorecards, it's a fairly simple process. But, in most cases, there is some discussion to be had. And what you want is the group to come together and really go through and expose in the right way the pros and cons of each candidate so that the final decision is made on the basis of a scoring chart, but also a debate around skill set.
That's really interesting. And in terms of the feedback side of things to the candidate and the transparency, how transparent are you or were you on that feedback element in terms of you're clearly very detailed and you know exactly where a candidate might be slightly more advanced or better than another? Would you share that back with the candidates that were in the process, or how would you approach that side of things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question there. And I think some candidates really want feedback.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then my view is you give them as honest feedback as you possibly can. And, sometimes that message is not an easy one to deliver. But if the candidate really wants that feedback of where they fell down or where they were perhaps, second of 2, as it were, then you should give it to them. Other candidates, and I've been in that situation a number of times, other candidates don't necessarily want feedback because actually they know where they dropped the ball. And you know that you were poor on a particular answer and you let yourself down, or you didn't gel with one of the panel members. And therefore, you pretty much know that somebody else will have done a better job and almost certainly gets offered it. So if that's the case, then and you don't want to hear that, that's absolutely fine. So I sort of play it. It's not a hard and fast rule. We will give you feedback whether you want it or not. But the question is always asked. We will provide feedback if you want it. Please let us know, sort of thing.
Yeah. So it's just giving the candidate the option of solidifying where they went wrong or not, which I think is a great approach because it also puts the power back into the candidate's hands as well.
Well, I think, yeah, and also, there's nothing worse than me to say you did really well. There was just one candidate that was slightly better, slightly further ahead than you. Well, clearly because you've offered the job to somebody else. But what was the what was the point? Was that an experience point of view? Was that a chemistry point of view? Was that a specific answer? What was that? Because for that candidate who inevitably will be disappointed. You want them to go, look, you're a really good candidate, and actually, if we can give you this bit of help, then next time that might nudge you over the line.
Yeah, and I think from an experience perspective, that's almost easier to go, look, I don't have that experience, or I need to get that experience. I think but equally as well, if it's a chemistry element, then as a candidate that it wouldn't have worked longer term, because if there is a chemistry issue with the people that you're going to be working so closely with, then the working environment is just not going to be as conducive as somebody else where the chemistry is good and where the values are met properly and where there's much more of a collaborative working approach, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's right. And that chemistry may well work really well in another environment
Yeah.
or with another organization or with another leadership style. So, we're not saying that our way is right and another way is wrong. It's just, it has got to work for the organization. The organization invariably has been operating for a period of time, unless you join the startup right from the start. And therefore, there are ways of working that you need to be able to fit into. Now, that's not groupthink or that's not cloning, because actually you do want some diversity of thought, but there are parameters in which somebody will work really well or somebody might not work well. And if you disrupt a machine that's working well, particularly the closer you get, in sporting terms, to a major event, that's pretty disruptive.
And how, just diving into that a little bit, how did you ensure that you managed to get that diversity of thought without becoming an organization that was groupthink? Because you've all got to be working towards the same goal and the same vision and the same values. But having somebody in there that can question or that can potentially bring something slightly more combative, not the right word, but something that can ask those questions that might then lead to a better outcome, because not everyone's going in the same direction, as it were. How did you kind of combat that when you're looking for people that do have that kind of fit, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I've always found and I've enjoyed having a degree of competitive, constructive tension in a management team. That challenge is good. That's what you
Yeah.
want. You don't want all that warfare, but you do want, challenge, and you do want somebody to ask the question, and you do want somebody, whoever's presenting a solution or proposal or whatever, to be able to justify it.
Mm.
And so that's really important. I think in terms of trying to find that individual, there's a couple of things. One is, and I think we did this very well in the Birmingham cycle, much better actually than the previous cycle, is you want to cast that recruitment net as far as possible. So traditionally, sports organizations have advertised in certain media, and those media you still should advertise in, the Sport England, UK Sport websites, that sort of stuff. That will bring in some very good candidates. And you don't dismiss those candidates at all. But you've also got to cast the net a bit wider. And so we looked to advertise on platforms or in media that were not traditionally sport orientated, or were much more diverse, or were used by partners in the industry that were not perhaps in the high performance sector, but that were more in the grassroots sector. So you actually start, hopefully, by your very long list or your initial list being much more diverse. The other thing that we do, and I'm very strong on, is job ads tend to be very good about saying what they want, which is good because you need to be clear. But I think it's also clear to bust some myths and say, it is not essential to have a degree. It is not essential to have been to a Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games before. It is not essential to have 5 years sports experience. So actually be explicit in saying these are not essential. If you've got that experience, we still want you. We still want your application because you still might be the best candidate who we're looking for.
Yeah.
But we are very happy to consider applications that don't have those particular boxes ticked on their CV. Because if you've got the right skill set and technically you're competent, and clearly coming in from other sectors, there are plenty of extremely competent people out there, that if you can bring that competency and that experience and that broader vision and fit into a management team, then you're extremely valuable.
Yeah, and I've said this before on this podcast as well. In sports has a slightly arrogant view of itself in the sense that it thinks that unless you work in sport, you can't learn the industry unless you come from the ground up. And I think the nuance of sport, as it were, is one of the easiest things that actually you can learn, because if you've got the business knowledge and you've got the business understanding that you can bring in and the skills and experience in other sectors, actually everyone knows about sport. Everyone has either played it or has watched it or has loved it, and so actually learning the almost behind the scenes of sport is one of the more easy things to do. It's
Yeah,
much
yeah,
easier to
no,
come into sport and do that than it is to go in and be a trader on the floor of the stock exchange.
yeah, no. I mean, if, in simple terms, product knowledge is easier
Yeah,
to get up to speed quickly in sport than it is if you go into the IT industry or the brewing
yeah,
industry or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Um, so what we try and do is end up with a long list that's got the cross section on, because ultimately the best candidate might still be the one that's come with the 20 years sport experience. That
Mm.
still might be the right fit, but it should not be the starting point that that's the candidate. That's the most likely candidate. So you've got to be open minded about this.
Okay, I completely agree. I suppose the $1 million question then is, Paul, were any of the people that were finally employed outside the sports industry?
Yes, they were. Yes,
Oh, there you go.
yes, and I mean, what there were more from. I would argue as being sort of not completely from outside, but there were a couple that we brought in from outside. But there were certainly more in the areas of the broader sport and leisure market that many organisations wouldn't perceive to be frontline sport.
Yeah, and I think
So
nowadays as well, the periphery of sport is huge, and that's another market that I think is underserved and probably untapped a little bit.
yes, yeah, and if you take sport, you tend to think of as being Premier League football or major events or whatever. But sport, leisure, that market is absolutely enormous and
Mm.
stretches, goes up all over the place with a huge amount of people involved or have been involved with a huge amount of different skills. So, in my mind, you're bonkers not to go and try and tap into that.
I couldn't agree more. I want to go back to the first answer that you gave, and we started with the positives, and we spent a long time on those positives, which is great. But in terms of the negatives of your experience within the recruitment world and being hired, what are the things that are the no goes for you? What do you look to avoid? What have you made sure that you've avoided when you are hiring?
I think key things for me really are to have a process that's as smooth as possible for the candidate, and for a process wherever possible to be as short as possible. And actually, if it's a no-no, tell them it's a no-no from almost from day one type thing. So timescales are one things. Also, people, you come into an interview, whoever you are, doesn't matter you've been interviewed for the first job ever or the biggest job in sport, you're going to be nervous. And I think it is certainly the role of whoever is chairing that panel or leading that panel and the panel members, if it is a panel, and most are these days, to make the candidate feel as comfortable as possible, because you want to get the best out of the candidate. And actually, at the end of it, you want the candidate to go away and go, oh, I like those. I'd like to work with those. So I think that's really important. I think it's really important that you present an accurate and honest and authentic view of the organization, not this sort of fluffy cloud view that says, in a perfect world, we'd be like this. Well, you aspire to that, but every organization has got its thorns and its challenges. And I think you need to be upfront with candidates and let them know what it is. And coming into sport, there are some obvious things, particularly if you're coming in from outside, is one of the first things that are most important for people to understand is you generally work antisocial hours.
Yeah,
If you like your weekends off, sport isn't a great place to be, because your main trading day is normally a Saturday or a Sunday sort of thing.
yeah,
So, I mean, that's blindingly obvious, but I think it's important that the candidate understands what sort of organisation they're potentially coming into. And we've touched on it already. And if it doesn't go right, and of course for all bar one of the candidates, it generally doesn't go right, is where you want that feedback, get it. If you don't want it, fine, walk away. You know roughly what went wrong in the interview and go off and think about it.
yeah. I think it's interesting because I think there's a perception, and probably rightly so, ultimately, is that if you're applying for a job or you've been approached for a job, you want it. You want to get that job, and therefore companies, consultancies, whoever can be a little bit complacent in that approach and in that, whether that's giving feedback, whether that's the time frame, whether that's the length of time it takes to go through the recruitment process. Whereas actually, especially as you get to those more senior levels, the candidate will have a choice. They will have a choice to go, do I want to be somewhere that takes this long, or why is it taking so long? Why are we not getting efficient communications? Is there something in the back end of this organization that potentially I don't want to work for because of the slightly poor way of the recruitment process potentially? And I think that's something that isn't necessarily reflected on very much within organizations. And look, I've been guilty of that myself when I've recruited, in the sense that you've got so many other things to do, but ultimately, if you're recruiting someone, that's a high priority, because you need to bring that person into the business, and you need that person to be very good, because that's what you want to do for that business.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. In 95% of the cases, the candidate wants the job,
Yeah,
so fine. But treat them with respect. One of the just on that sort of respect aspect, one of the things that I've seen from sort of both ends of the spectrum is where you've got a very rigid process that has a series of questions. You clearly need a degree of similarity in interviews to allow you to compare candidates. But this, thou shalt not deviate from the line of questioning, I think, can tend to make it a fairly uncomfortable and sort of stilted process. And what I've seen, and what is I found very frustrating, is you're asked a question and you answer it, but your answer is perhaps a bit more expansive than the question particularly asks, and effectively you've answered the following question, but the following question is then asked to you, and you say, well, actually, as per my previous answer. I find that it's a poor way of interviewing, but it's also disrespectful to the candidate, because you're not actually listening to what the candidate's saying, I don't think.
yeah. I was going to say that interviewing is a skill. It's a skill that needs to be learned. And if you happen to be someone that's slightly more junior or slightly less experienced in interviewing, actually getting the opportunity to do a bit of learning and development on the best way to interview somebody, and that includes actively listening to their answers and reacting to those, rather than just question answer,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
there's so many different things. You said earlier, there's so many different things that are lost within the answers if you do take that approach. And I think you are potentially then opening yourself up to taking the wrong person through, because you haven't delved into a particular bit of skill, or a particular experience, or a particular way that that person works.
yeah. And I think there's a bit more of an obsession these days with ensuring that the process can't be challenged,
Yeah,
and I understand that, and you do want to produce a fair process, but if it doesn't allow any ad lib deviation, wandered off a true line, as it were, to me, you, you're not potentially going to get the best out of the candidate, and you might not get the best candidate. Now, you probably won't know you've not got the best candidate in the end, but the point is, I think, there are candidates that will fall foul of that process who are actually extremely strong, but don't naturally fit into that quite regimented, almost exam style.
yeah, yeah. Agreed. Right, Paul, we've flown through 25 minutes there, and it's been an excellent conversation. But I'm very conscious of your time, so we need to get to the final three questions that we ask everybody. And we ask the same questions to every single guest, and it's brevity in the answers is the name of the game. So, number one, what is the most frustrating thing about recruitment?
Well, I've covered it. Large panels, inflexible exam style process.
Wonderful. You don't have to name them, but you're also more than welcome to. Who's been your best hire and why?
Well, I did think about this a lot. Now, there's a number of candidates that I've recruited who are now in senior positions, which is quite encouraging. But actually, and there is some recency bias in this, but I will name him. It was the chef de mission for Commonwealth Games England and the Birmingham Games, Mark England. And the reason he was the best hire was he's also chef de mission for the British Olympic Association. He's the best in the world at his job, and we got him for nothing. So that was a pretty good hire in my view. We got him on loan. He was brilliant.
Ticks a lot of boxes, and we'll be sure to tag Mark in it as well to make sure that he hears this. And then final one thing that you would change about the recruitment world.
again, touched on it, but I think it's worth going back to honesty and feedback.
Yeah.
You know, where it is requested, be honest with the candidate. It might not be what they want to hear, and it might not be easy for you to tell them, but don't just give them a glib, you know, you did really well, but sort of pat on the head, thank you very much, but somebody was marginally ahead of you, because that doesn't help the individual at all.
Yeah. Great. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's greatly appreciated. I know there's a huge amount of people can take from this conversation. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks for coming on Talent Talks.
Pleasure. All the best.
Cheers.
Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.